Putin does not want peace. He has made it very, very clear throughout that his initial maximalist goals regarding Ukraine still stand.
President Trump is due to speak to President Putin tomorrow to discuss the proposed ceasefire in Ukraine. Tonight, the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt said we've never been closer to peace, and she confirmed that the two leaders would discuss the division of Ukraine's land and assets. In the Commons earlier, the British Foreign Secretary David Lammy said Ukraine has shown it is serious about peace, and he challenged President Putin to respond.
Are you serious, Mr. Putin, about peace? Will you stop the fighting? Or will you drag your feet and play games? Play lip service to a ceasefire while still pummeling Ukraine? My warning to Mr. Putin is this: if you are serious, prove it with a full and unconditional ceasefire now.
Well, that was the Foreign Secretary David Lammy in the Commons. Let's talk to Cormac Smith, former Special Advisor for Ukraine's Foreign Minister. Good evening to you, Cormac.
Carol, hello. Nice to join you.
Well, good to have you with us. A full and unconditional ceasefire David Lammy's talking about. It doesn't sound as though that's what President Putin is going to agree to, does it?
Look, Carol, there's very few things one can be certain about at this juncture in time, but one of them is this: Putin does not want peace. He has made it very, very clear throughout that his initial maximalist goals regarding Ukraine still stand, and that is the obliteration of the absorption of Ukraine and the obliteration of the Ukrainian state and any sense of Ukrainian nationhood. We know that Russia always negotiates in bad faith. We know certainly if it's to do with Ukraine, they always break their word. So even if any agreement is struck, and that's jumping significantly ahead, I absolutely believe that Putin would take that as time to rest and rebuild his forces. He has taken a hell of a hammering in the last 3 years, and he will come back later for more. The Ukrainians know this, and the other people in the eastern neighborhood, like the Baltics and the Poles, they know it as well. And I think throughout Europe, and I think in fairness, in Britain, we know that because, of course, I was part of our mission out there between 2016 and 2018 when I worked at the heart of the Ukrainian government.
What about President Trump, though? How do you think he is going to approach this crucial conversation with President Putin? Now, he has warned that he could impose further sanctions if Putin doesn't agree to negotiate. But again, then tonight we've heard the White House press secretary saying the two leaders will discuss the division of Ukraine's land and assets. How concerned are you that President Trump won't be prepared to stand up to President Putin?
Well, look, the statement that the two of them will sit down and discuss the sharing out of Ukraine's assets effectively is absolutely horrible to hear. I jotted down before I came on, there's two problems and one big unknown here. One of the problems I think we've already touched on, it's that Putin's demands remain absolutely maximal, including not only keeping the land he has already taken, but more of the land which Ukraine still occupies, which includes a number of large cities and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens who would be consigned to the brutality of Russian occupation. And we know there's over 140,000 war crimes being investigated by the Ukrainians with the support of the international community. That's the first problem.
And we know, though, I was just going to say, we know also that the Russians have made it clear that they don't want any foreign troops on Ukrainian soil at a time when Keir Starmer is getting this coalition of the willing together. We're told 30 countries have signed up in some form or another. I mean, that is potentially a huge problem, isn't it?
Well, look, my second problem was, so far, the only one that President Trump seems to have put pressure on has been the Ukrainians. And daily, he mirrors and he mouths Kremlin talking points. So that's a problem. But the big unknown, I've got to say, what is going to happen if and when Putin refuses to agree to terms which will be acceptable to Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, which is, I'm afraid to say, is what I expect. And the big unknown is there have been some suggestions of threats from Donald Trump that he may impose sanctions, and we know that the Russian economy is very, very unstable at the moment. But will Trump actually use the massive force and power that he has at his disposal to coerce Vladimir Putin? That's the big unknown. I'm fearing that he won't, and that they will try and impose a capitulation onto Ukraine. And, that leaves it very much down to us. And if I could give one quote, it's the great Sir Bill Browder. It was my quote of the week last week, actually. He said, if Europe grows a backbone, the threat of Trump goes away. And I really feel that America, for the foreseeable future, certainly for the rest of this president's term, is effectively lost as a reliable security partner, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us in Europe. And this is really going to shift onto our shoulders more and more. That's not just our governments and our armed forces, it's us in society as well.
JJ from Bristol's already got in touch. He, looking at that discussion tomorrow between Presidents Putin and Trump, says it looks like two mafia bosses will be deciding how to rule over territory which they divide amongst themselves. It's just so sad. He says, I never thought I would live to see such an injustice in Europe again. Do keep your thoughts coming into us. Well, let's get some more on those talks tomorrow between President Trump and President Putin to discuss the proposed ceasefire in Ukraine. In the last hour, the American president posted on his social media site Truth Social saying many elements of the Ukraine deal have been agreed, but much remains, and that he looks forward to the call. Tonight, the White House press secretary Caroline Leavitt was upbeat about the prospects of a breakthrough.
As for Russia, as you know, the president announced last night on Air Force One on his return from his very busy weekend in Florida that he will be speaking to President Putin tomorrow. I won't get ahead of those negotiations, but I can say we are on the 10th yard line of peace, and we've never been closer to a peace deal than we are in this moment. And the president, as you know, is determined to get one done.
Well, she also confirmed that the two leaders would discuss the division of Ukraine's land and assets. Charles Kupchan is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as a senior director on the National Security Council under President Obama. Good evening to you, Charles.
Hi, Carol. Good to be back with you.
Oh, well, the White House is talking in optimistic terms, saying that they've never been closer to a peace deal. The question is what the terms of that will be. What do you think we should expect from these talks between President Trump and President Putin?
Well, are they closer to a peace deal than we've ever been? Yes, and that's because we've never been close to a peace deal. But I really don't think that at this point we have any sense of what Putin's game plan is. It's conceivable that he's sincere and that over the course of the next few weeks, we may see a tangible plan emerge that leads to a ceasefire. We also have good reason to believe not to take him at face value. He could just be playing for time, building up his forces, aiming to take more land from Ukraine. Let's see where we go. But I think Trump has to go into this conversation tomorrow knowing full well, or at least appreciating, that a bad deal is worse than no deal. He's got to hold the line when it comes to leaving the part of Ukraine that is still free, and that's about 80% of the country. He's got to make sure that they emerge from this deal as a success story, as a free, independent, defensible country. Putin has so far said, no way, I'm not going to accept that. So let's wait and see.
We've had the European Union's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, warning that Russia can't be trusted. I was talking just a little earlier on this programme to a former advisor to Ukraine's foreign minister, Cormac Smith, who was saying that he doesn't believe that Putin actually wants peace. Do you think that if he does play games on this, that President Trump will be willing to stand up to the Russian president?
We don't know. You know, over the last few weeks, Trump has said and done things that are quite shocking. Whether it's refusing to approve a resolution at the UN condemning Russian aggression, whether it is shouting down the president of Ukraine in the Oval Office, we just don't know where Trump's head is right now. But I do think that he needs Ukraine and he needs Europe on his side. He can't make a deal with Putin over the heads of the Ukrainians. In the end of the day, it's Zelensky who has to say yes. And I think Trump knows that. And so I do think that this is going to be a drawn out process, and that in the end of the day, Trump can't say yes to things that are unacceptable to Ukrainians or unacceptable to Europeans, because that will sink the deal.
And we know that, and we know, don't we, that President Putin has made it clear that he wants no foreign troops on Ukrainian soil, even if they're not under a NATO flag. This idea of some sort of coalition of the willing involving NATO countries. Putin's foreign minister has made it clear that's completely unacceptable. Putin has also made it clear that he wants full control over those four regions of Ukraine, which he has illegally invaded and he claims as Russian territory. We've got the White House talking about how they're going to be discussing the division of Ukraine's land and assets. There has to be a real concern that President Trump, who wants a deal, will sign up to something that is frankly just unacceptable to Ukraine and to its allies, including the UK.
Listen, I think that Trump is doing the right thing by trying to end this war and by building a constructive relationship with the Russians. I think if there's one thing that tantalizes Putin, it's not the end of the war, it's a working relationship with Donald Trump. Trump is his ticket to coming back in from the cold, and I think Putin wants that. The question is, can Putin live with 20% of Ukraine, maybe access to the Zaporizhia power plant, and call it a day? Or is he going to continue to ask for what he's been asking for all along, which is a neutral Ukraine, an exposed Ukraine, a Ukraine that ends up not being a real state because it gets reabsorbed into a Russian sphere of influence? We don't know whether Putin is ready to back down on those maximalist claims and make a deal, or whether this is just a delaying tactic and he still aims to subjugate Ukraine for the end as his end goal.
Just finally, Charles, we've had the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, making strenuous efforts to put together this coalition of the willing of nations that are willing to police a potential future ceasefire. Around 30 have said that they could be willing to contribute in some way. How realistic do you think that whole idea is, given Russia's attitude to foreign troops on Ukraine's soil? It said it simply won't accept that.
Well, you know, I think that the key issue here is, will Putin accept that 80% of Ukraine that is still free emerges as a strong state that can defend itself? Because Ukrainians have no reason to trust Putin. They need to have what it takes to stop him from doing this again. And Putin has said that no more conscription of Ukrainian troops, no more arms flowing into Ukraine from the West. Those are unacceptable conditions. I do think that if he can get his head around a deal, that he can live with some kind of peacekeeping force, a monitoring force, but it can't just be Europeans. I can imagine a force that has British presence, that has French participation, but also perhaps Indians and Bangladeshis and others that give it a multilateral umbrella, a UN umbrella. That strikes me as something that Putin could live with, just like he lived with the OSCE monitoring mission that was stood up after he went into Crimea in 2014.
Charles Kupchan, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former Senior Director at the US National Security Council. Great to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
You're listening to Times Radio. Let me just bring you some news we've had in the last hour. The last surviving Battle of Britain pilot, John Paddy Hemingway, has died at the age of 105. The Royal Air Force saying he died peacefully. He was one of the few and a revered figure in British aviation history and had played a key role in defending the United Kingdom against the Nazis in the summer of 1940. So that is the last surviving Battle of Britain pilot, John Paddy Hemingway, who has died at the age of 105.